Andrew Merritt stood at the edge of the small plot of land he had inherited, looking out over the rolling hills of Oregon. The wind stirred the branches of the towering pine trees that lined the perimeter of the property, their dark green needles contrasting with the vibrant blue sky above. This was the land of his childhood, the place where he had spent summers helping his grandfather, Henry Merritt, with land surveys and learning the ropes of what would become his lifelong passion. Henry had been a self-taught surveyor, a man with a keen eye for the land and an almost obsessive dedication to accuracy in his work. Andrew had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about mapping the rugged, uncharted parts of Oregon, and to him, this property, this patch of earth, wasn't just a piece of land. It was a legacy, a connection to his family's history that ran deep. Andrew, now in his early 40s, had been living in Portland for most of his adult life, where he had built a career as a professor of navigation and cartography. He had inherited the land after his grandfather's passing, but life in the city had kept him busy, and the property had remained largely untouched for years. It was only now, with the weight of his grandfather's passing still fresh, that he decided to finally return to the land and do something meaningful with it. He had always dreamed of building a small cabin or a garden retreat on the property, somewhere quiet, removed from the distractions of modern life. The plan was simple: restore the land to its natural beauty, build something modest, and honor his grandfather's memory in the process. He had been to the property a few times since the funeral, walking through the overgrown trails, reminiscing about the days when his grandfather had taught him how to read the land and navigate by the stars. But this visit felt different. This time, he was ready to get to work. Armed with a set of plans, a modest budget, and the faint echo of his grandfather's voice in his mind, Andrew was determined to transform the property into something more than just a patch of land. But as he stood there, taking in the expansive view of the valley, he felt a nagging sense of unease. Something wasn't right. He glanced down at the map in his hands. It was a copy of the survey that his grandfather had created for the property years ago, a meticulous document that showed every corner of the land, every natural boundary, and every landmark. As Andrew unfolded the map, his eyes scanned the familiar markings: the ancient oak tree on the eastern edge, the winding creek that cut through the western side, and the ridge of rocks that bordered the southern boundary. The map was old, weathered by time, but it was still as accurate as ever. It was Henry's work, and had been the foundation of everything on this land. The map had been passed down through generations, preserved in the family as a symbol of their connection to the land. Andrew trusted it, just as his grandfather had. But something caught his attention. There, on the map, was a small note scribbled in the corner. It was a marking he didn't recognize, a line that appeared to intersect the southwestern corner of the property. The line didn't match any of the natural landmarks, and there was no reference to it anywhere in his grandfather's notes. Intrigued, Andrew stepped forward, squinting at the faint marking, his mind racing. It was as if someone had drawn a line across the land, a new boundary, a line that shouldn't be there. His heart began to race, and a strange feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. He had lived here all his life. He knew the land. But this was new. Folding the map back up, Andrew turned and made his way toward the southwestern edge of the property, where the marking on the map seemed to indicate a point of interest. The walk was familiar to him. He had traversed this part of the land countless times as a child, running through the woods with his grandfather, learning how to identify the subtle shifts in the terrain. But as he approached the area in question, he felt an odd tension in the air. It was as if the land itself was trying to communicate something to him, something he couldn't quite grasp. When he reached the spot where the line was marked, Andrew was taken aback. There, in the middle of what should have been a quiet patch of forest, were 4 metal posts, each standing at the corners of an invisible rectangle. The posts were new, their bright orange flags fluttering in the wind. It was an unmistakable sign, a surveyor's mark, a boundary line. But who had put them there, and why? Andrew's pulse quickened as he moved closer to inspect the posts. His mind raced as he scanned the surrounding area. The ground was soft and there were no visible signs of construction, no roads or new paths that could explain the markers. This was his land, the place where he had spent countless hours with his grandfather, and yet now it was being encroached upon. The posts seemed out of place, a violation of the land's sanctity. He crouched down, inspecting the posts more closely. They were professionally installed, each one secured deep into the soil, their flags bright and freshly attached. The markings on the posts were clear. They identified the property as belonging to the South Valley Development Corporation, a name Andrew didn't recognize. He frowned, trying to recall whether he had ever seen this name before. It didn't ring any bells, but the presence of these posts told him one thing for sure: someone was claiming ownership of his land, or at least part of it. As he stood up and brushed the dirt from his hands, Andrew felt a sense of urgency rise within him. He had to get to the bottom of this. But the question was, who was behind this? And why were they marking off his land as if it were theirs? Andrew's mind began to churn with possibilities. He knew that land disputes were not uncommon, especially in areas where property values were rising and new developments were always on the horizon. But this was different. This wasn't just a disagreement over property lines. This felt like an attempt to erase his family's history, to take something that didn't belong to them. And he couldn't let that happen. His first instinct was to head to the local county office, to inquire about any recent land transactions or boundary changes. But something told him that this wasn't just a clerical error. It was something more deliberate, more sinister. He needed more information before he could take any further steps. As he turned to leave the area, he glanced back at the markers one last time, his jaw tightening with resolve. This wasn't just about property lines, it was about protecting the memory of his grandfather, the legacy of his family, and the land that had been passed down through generations. And if someone was trying to take it from him, they would have to go through him first. The following morning, Andrew woke to the familiar hum of the city beyond his cabin. But his mind was anything but settled. His thoughts kept returning to the metal posts and the strange markings on his land. They haunted him, nagging at him as he drank his coffee and scrolled through his emails in the quiet solitude of his kitchen. There was something about them that didn't sit right, something that felt engineered, planned with a level of care that spoke of intent rather than a simple mistake. Whoever had placed those markers knew exactly what they were doing. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far bigger than he had initially anticipated. The sun had barely begun to rise when Andrew decided he couldn't wait any longer. He grabbed his jacket, his old boots, and set out for the local county office. The drive through the countryside was peaceful, the roads winding through tall trees and past fields that stretched out into the distance. It was easy to get lost in the beauty of the land, but Andrew's mind was focused. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them by waiting for someone to come to him. The thought of those metal posts on his land and the bold claim they represented only drove him faster. Whoever thought they could just stake a claim on his family's property was going to learn quickly that they had underestimated him. When he arrived at the county office, the small building was quiet. A few employees sat behind the front desk making phone calls and typing on computers, but it didn't take long for Andrew to be directed to the Land Records Department. The man behind the counter was middle-aged, with a graying beard and tired eyes, but his expression brightened when Andrew explained why he was there. He'd seen his fair share of land disputes in his time, but this one was different. Andrew's name carried weight in these parts. The Merritts were known in the county for their contribution to the local community, and his grandfather's reputation as a skilled surveyor had earned him a great deal of respect. "Can I help you with anything in particular, Mr. Merritt?" the clerk asked as he motioned for Andrew to sit down. "I'm here to inquire about some recent land transactions, particularly regarding a piece of property I inherited from my grandfather. There seems to be some confusion about the boundaries, Andrew said, laying the map he had found the previous day on the counter. He pointed to the southwestern corner, where the strange line appeared. This wasn't part of the original survey. Someone's marked it as theirs, but it's clearly part of my land. The clerk squinted at the map, running his fingers over the lines before glancing back up at Andrew. I'll pull up the records for you, but I'll warn you, there's been a lot of development going on in that area recently. You might want to get a lawyer involved. Andrew's stomach tightened at the mention of a lawyer, but he held back his frustration. It wasn't the first time he had heard of developers trying to take advantage of the land. The county was growing, and developers were eager to buy up every available piece of real estate they could find. But what unsettled Andrew was the method. This wasn't the usual quiet purchase of land. This was a brazen, almost reckless claim over something that had never been for sale. As the clerk dug through the files, Andrew sat in silence, his mind racing through all the possible scenarios. The idea of a simple clerical error or a mistake in paperwork seemed far too neat an explanation. This was more than that. It had to be. There was something methodical about it, as if someone had been waiting for the right moment to swoop in and claim the land. "Here we go," the clerk finally said, breaking the silence. He pushed a thick stack of papers across the counter to Andrew, who eagerly flipped through them. The documents were a mix of surveys, maps, and legal descriptions, and they appeared to be in order. But as he skimmed through them, Andrew's heart sank. The land in question, the piece marked by the metal posts, was indeed on the records, but not in the way his grandfather had mapped it. The records showed that the land had been reclassified as part of a new development zone, a reclassification that had taken place just a few months ago. And the most alarming part? The records indicated that the land was now under the jurisdiction of a new governing body, something Andrew had never heard of before, South Valley Development Corporation. The corporation had filed for zoning changes, had submitted new plans for community development, and, most shockingly, had already secured agreements with the local government. Andrew's hands trembled as he read the words. He had no idea what South Valley Development Corporation was, but the name sounded corporate and faceless, exactly the kind of entity that could bulldoze through regulations, twist arms, and erase the history of a place like his family's land. What made it worse was that these changes had all been filed while Andrew had been away, living his life in the city. It was as if someone had quietly moved in and manipulated the system without anyone noticing. The land, his land, was now officially marked for redevelopment, and Andrew was left standing in the middle of it with nothing but his grandfather's legacy and a handful of outdated documents. His mind reeled with the implications. Who had authorized this? How had they managed to get this through without anyone noticing? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a land grab. It was part of a larger scheme to control the area, to profit off the land his family had fought so hard to preserve. The South Valley Development Corporation wasn't just looking to buy land. They were systematically erasing the boundaries that had once defined the area, replacing them with their own corporate vision. And what better way to do that than to claim ownership over land that had been left untouched for decades? Andrew was about to ask the clerk for more details when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, he answered it. "Mr. Merritt?" a voice on the other end asked. It was sharp, professional, but there was an underlying tone of arrogance that Andrew didn't like. "This is Samuel Trent from South Valley Development Corporation. We're reaching out to property owners in the area regarding our latest development project. I understand you may have some concerns about the recent boundary changes. I'd be happy to discuss it with you further if you're available." Andrew's heart skipped a beat. The call confirmed everything he had suspected. South Valley was already trying to get ahead of him, trying to smooth things over before he could raise a real challenge. They were trying to act like they were doing him a favor, but Andrew wasn't fooled. He could hear the subtle pressure in Trent's voice, the unspoken implication that it would be easier for everyone if Andrew just let it go. "No, Mr. Trent, Andrew replied, his voice steady but firm. "You're not doing me a favor. I don't want any part of your development. I'm not interested in selling my land or having it reclassified. I'll be taking this matter up with my lawyer." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a faint sigh. "I understand, Mr. Merritt, but I'll remind you that the zoning changes are legal, and the local authorities have already approved them. We'll be moving forward with or without your cooperation, but we'd prefer to handle this amicably." Andrew's grip on the phone tightened. "There's nothing amicable about taking what's not yours." He ended the call and sat there for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation sink in. He couldn't let them get away with this. This wasn't just about land. It was about preserving what his grandfather had built and ensuring that no one could just erase the history of his family. It was clear now. This was going to be a fight. But the fight wasn't going to be easy. He needed to be strategic. He needed more than just a few documents. He needed to dig deeper, to understand exactly what South Valley Development Corporation was really after, and how they had managed to manipulate the system so effectively. If he was going to stand a chance, he would need to play their game, but he wasn't going to lose. Not without a fight. Andrew spent the next few days in a haze of confusion and frustration. He couldn't believe what was happening, couldn't fathom how things had escalated so quickly. What started as an innocent visit to the land, a simple desire to reconnect with his grandfather's legacy, had turned into a full-blown battle over his family's property. But now he had the clear knowledge that someone was trying to steal it from him. South Valley Development Corporation had their eyes set on what they believed was easy prey. Someone who didn't know the rules of their game. Someone who was just a man with a few old maps and memories of his grandfather. They were wrong. He spent hours each day pacing through the old cabin, looking over his grandfather's surveyor's notes, trying to make sense of it all. The documents, yellowed with age but still legible, painted a clear picture of how the land had been measured and marked decades ago, long before South Valley Development ever existed. Andrew could see it now, how the original lines drawn by his grandfather, each one etched with precision, had been deliberately altered by whoever was behind the recent changes. The old landmarks his grandfather had carefully recorded, the riverbank, the ridge of rocks, even the ancient oak tree, all of it had been deliberately pushed aside to make room for something new, something profitable. He couldn't understand why anyone would go to such lengths. But as he stared at the papers, one thing became clear. The changes had been made with intention, and that meant someone knew exactly what they were doing. But Andrew wasn't an easy target, and he knew that playing by the rules meant staying ahead of the people who were trying to manipulate the system. He needed to act quickly, but he couldn't do it alone. His first step was to reach out to his lawyer, Sarah Bennett, a no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for handling complex land disputes. She had helped him with a few minor issues in the past, but nothing of this magnitude. He wasn't sure if she could help, but she was his first line of defense. Sarah listened intently as Andrew explained the situation, the quiet anger in her voice barely concealed. "You've got a problem on your hands, Andrew. It's not just about the property. It's about power. About people who think they can bend the rules to suit their needs," she said, her voice low and measured. South Valley isn't just some development company. They've got connections, resources, and a network of people who can make this happen without blinking an eye. You're going to have to fight fire with fire. Andrew knew she was right, but fighting fire with fire meant understanding the rules of the game. Rules that South Valley had already bent in their favor. It wasn't enough to just show up at a meeting and claim his land. He needed proof. He needed more than just the old maps and survey records. He needed to dig deeper into the legal side of things, into the recent zoning changes and how they had been approved so easily. Over the next few days, Sarah set up meetings with experts in land law, real estate development, and local government regulations. Andrew spent his nights poring over documents, trying to trace the chain of events that had led to this point. He discovered that South Valley had quietly purchased neighboring parcels of land over the past few years, using shell companies to hide the true extent of their dealings. The zoning changes that had been filed under the guise of community development were actually part of a larger plan to create a luxury resort on the riverfront, complete with condos, private marinas, and recreational areas. And Andrew's land was smack in the middle of it all. But what unsettled him the most was the way South Valley had managed to pull it all off. They had used the local government's approval process to slip the zoning changes through with minimal oversight. There were no public hearings, no notification to the surrounding community. It had all been done behind closed doors, using a series of legal maneuvers that made it nearly impossible to challenge unless you were already entrenched in the system. He couldn't believe how easily they had done it. South Valley had bypassed every regulation and every procedure designed to protect small landowners like him. And as much as he hated to admit it, the more he dug into the records, the more he realized that the system was stacked against him. The county had approved the zoning changes with little more than a rubber stamp, and the public seemed to have no idea what was happening behind the scenes. It was a perfect storm of corporate greed and bureaucratic indifference. But Andrew wasn't going to let them get away with it. He couldn't. His grandfather's legacy was too important. And even if the odds were stacked against him, he was willing to fight every step of the way. The first move came when Sarah sent a letter to South Valley, demanding that they provide a full accounting of their land purchases, zoning applications, and any communications with local officials. It was a bold move, but Andrew knew it was necessary. They had to know he was serious. He wasn't just going to sit back and let them take what was his. It didn't take long for South Valley to respond, but when they did, it was in the form of a legal threat. Their attorney, a man named Gregory Sinclair, sent a letter warning Andrew that his actions were interfering with a lawful development, and that he was subject to legal consequences if he didn't cease and desist. The letter was polite on the surface but contained a thinly veiled threat. "We are a powerful corporation with the backing of the local government. You are outmatched and you will lose." The message was clear. They were playing hardball, and Andrew was out of his depth, but that only fueled Andrew's determination. He wasn't going to back down. This was no longer just about land. It was about standing up to people who thought they could do whatever they wanted regardless of the consequences. He needed to find a way to turn the tables, to expose the corruption and the underhanded tactics that South Valley had used to get where they were. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had something they didn't expect: knowledge. Andrew's grandfather had been a surveyor, and his work had been meticulous. Henry Merritt's survey records were more than just maps. They were a record of the land itself, a guide to the natural features and boundaries that had stood for generations. And in the eyes of the law, those records carried weight. They were recognized as the original documentation of the land's boundaries, and as far as Andrew could tell, there was nothing in the new zoning records that could legally override them. He called Sarah again, outlining his plan. "I'm going to use my grandfather's records. I'm going to prove that South Valley's changes are illegal, that their claim to the land is based on falsified information. We'll take this to court, and we'll make sure everyone knows what's really going on." Sarah was silent for a moment, considering his words. "It's risky, but it's your best shot. If you can get a judge to recognize your grandfather's work as the legally binding survey, you might have a chance." Andrew nodded, determination setting in. He wasn't going to let them take what was his. The battle was just beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. The first escalation had begun. Andrew's strategy was simple, yet risky. He would leverage his grandfather's original survey records and challenge South Valley development in court, proving that their claim to the land was built on a house of cards. He knew that the fight was going to be long and grueling, but the more he dug into the situation, the more he realized just how much was at stake. South Valley had already shown their willingness to push the boundaries, manipulating legal frameworks and bypassing regulations to suit their own interests. They had already taken steps to secure the land, using their financial clout and political connections to grease the wheels of local government, all while avoiding the scrutiny of the public. But they hadn't anticipated one thing: Andrew Merritt's stubbornness and his ability to see through their charade. As the days passed, Andrew, with Sarah's guidance, began to assemble his case. He scoured the records, diving deeper into the chain of ownership and title for his family's land. What he found was staggering. South Valley had not only made alterations to the land's official zoning, but had also engaged in a series of behind-the-scenes deals that had bypassed normal channels. They had quietly acquired neighboring properties, manipulated environmental assessments, and pushed through applications for new development projects under the radar. The more he investigated, the more it became apparent that this wasn't just about taking his property. It was part of a much larger scheme to overhaul the entire region for profit, a scheme that had been underway for years without anyone noticing. The local government, it seemed, was a willing participant, turning a blind eye to the questionable tactics used by the developers. But the thing that disturbed Andrew the most wasn't the shady dealings. It was the realization that his grandfather's work had been undermined. Henry Merritt had spent his life mapping the land with precision, documenting every natural feature with meticulous care. And yet here, in these official documents, was a blatant disregard for everything his grandfather had worked for. South Valley had altered the land's boundaries to fit their agenda, manipulating the very data that was supposed to be the foundation for all development in the region. The new zoning maps had been created with disregard for the history of the land, ignoring centuries of accurate surveying in favor of corporate greed. Sarah, as always, was calm and focused. She took the lead in filing the legal paperwork, reaching out to experts in land law, environmental policy, and survey documentation. The stakes were high. If South Valley's alterations were accepted by the court, it could set a dangerous precedent, allowing developers to simply redraw property lines and rewrite history to suit their needs. Andrew, meanwhile, spent long hours in his cabin, poring over the documents with a mix of anger and disbelief. It was clear that this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for control of the land, for the right to preserve the history and legacy of his family. His grandfather had always taught him that the land had a voice, that it held stories that could not be erased, and that those who understood its language would never be at a loss for how to protect it. Henry had always said that the work of a surveyor wasn't just about mapping boundaries, it was about understanding the land's soul. Andrew had learned that lesson well, and now he was ready to put it into practice. But even with all his knowledge and determination, he knew that this battle was far from over. As the case slowly made its way through the legal system, Andrew began to encounter more resistance. The legal teams representing South Valley were ruthless. They filed motion after motion, attempting to dismiss the case on technical grounds, arguing that Andrew's grandfather's survey records were outdated and irrelevant in light of the new developments and modern land use practices. But Sarah was unyielding, constantly countering their arguments with evidence that showed how South Valley's actions violated established zoning laws and historical precedents. It wasn't long before Andrew started to feel the pressure of the situation. The longer the case dragged on, the more South Valley seemed to tighten their grip. They began pressuring local businesses and neighbors, encouraging them to back the development plans and publicly distance themselves from Andrew's claims. In the town, whispers began to spread, with some people suggesting that Andrew was standing in the way of progress, that he was being stubborn and selfish by holding on to the land. The tension between the developers and the local community grew, and Andrew realized that the battle wasn't just legal, it was personal. He had become a symbol of resistance, and with that came a growing sense of isolation. People who had once been friends, neighbors who had shared stories with his grandfather, now looked at him with uncertainty. They were afraid of what standing with him might cost them. And it wasn't just the community that was turning against him. The pressure from South Valley seemed to be intensifying on all fronts. Late one evening, as Andrew was returning from a meeting with Sarah, he received an anonymous letter. It was a simple message, handwritten in black ink. "You can't stop this. It's bigger than you. Let it go before it's too late." The words were chilling, the threat unspoken but clear. Andrew knew it was a warning from someone who was a part of the system, someone who had a vested interest in seeing him fail. He burned the letter immediately, but the fear it instilled lingered. Despite the mounting pressure, Andrew refused to back down. He began reaching out to other landowners in the area, gathering support for his cause. He wasn't alone in this fight. There were others who had been overlooked, others who had watched as developers quietly took control of their land. He started to meet with them in secret, discussing ways to fight back against the corporation's growing influence. Andrew realized that the key to winning this battle wasn't just about proving that South Valley was wrong. It was about creating a united front of people who understood what was at stake. The more they rallied together, the more he felt that he wasn't fighting alone. This wasn't just his fight, it was a fight for the land itself, for the community, and for the future of the region. It was during one of these late-night meetings that a breakthrough came. One of the neighboring landowners, a woman named Evelyn Gray, revealed that she had once worked with a former employee of South Valley, someone who had been involved in the company's early dealings. Evelyn had kept quiet for years, not wanting to stir trouble, but now, seeing how things were unfolding, she knew she had to speak out. She passed along a set of confidential documents, internal emails and memos, that detailed the company's plans to bypass environmental regulations and manipulate zoning laws to make their development more profitable. It was a smoking gun. The evidence was damning. With this new information in hand, Andrew felt a renewed sense of hope. He shared the documents with Sarah, and together, they began to build a case that was no longer based solely on historical surveys and zoning laws. This was about corruption, about power and influence being used to crush those who didn't have the resources to fight back. And now, with the proof they needed, Andrew felt that they had the upper hand. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. The legal battle intensified, with Sarah preparing a new round of motions to present in court. Andrew spent his days meeting with experts and working behind the scenes, while South Valley's legal team worked tirelessly to try and discredit him. The fight had escalated beyond the courtroom. It had become a battle for public opinion, for the hearts and minds of the people who lived in the community. And in that, Andrew found strength. The fight was no longer just about land. It was about standing up to the forces that sought to control it, to rewrite the history of the land in their favor. But as the case moved forward, Andrew began to feel a growing sense of dread. South Valley wasn't backing down. If anything, they were becoming more aggressive. The next move would be the most critical one yet. If he could expose their corruption, he could stop them from claiming the land. But time was running out. The question was no longer if they would come for the land, it was when. The battle had reached a fever pitch. Andrew Merritt felt it in his bones. He could see it in the way the town was starting to turn its back on him, in the way South Valley Development's influence seemed to seep into every corner of the community. At first, he had thought that the legal pressure alone would be enough to put a stop to their plans. He believed that once he presented the evidence of corruption and illegal land manipulation, the truth would speak for itself. But as the weeks dragged on, he realized how naive he had been. South Valley wasn't just a corporation. It was a force, a machine, and it had long arms that reached into places he had never imagined. The more they pushed, the more the local government, once sympathetic to his cause, started to distance itself from him. The once neutral stance of his neighbors began to shift, and soon it felt like everyone in town had been pulled into South Valley's orbit. The first real sign of this shift came when a group of local business owners who had previously shown support for Andrew's stance were suddenly found speaking at a town hall meeting in favor of the development. Andrew wasn't at the meeting, but Sarah had sent him a report detailing how the entire narrative had shifted. It seemed that South Valley's legal team had gone beyond just threatening to bury him under piles of paperwork. They were using the town's own people against him. They had started to sell the idea of a new, vibrant community, one that would bring jobs, growth, and tourism to the area, with a glistening resort on the riverfront as the centerpiece. For the first time, Andrew began to feel the full weight of the political game South Valley had been playing for years. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about perception. And for Andrew, it was beginning to feel like an insurmountable challenge. The community that had once embraced his family's presence in the area now saw him as an obstacle to progress, a man holding on to a piece of history that no longer fit with the future they had been promised. The pressure was starting to show. It wasn't just the legal threats. It was the whispers in the streets, the looks from people he'd known his whole life, the feeling of isolation that had begun to creep into every corner of his existence. The walls were closing in, and Andrew knew it was only a matter of time before South Valley would make its move, not just in court, but in a more direct, perhaps even violent way. That morning, as he prepared for another meeting with Sarah, a knock came at the door of his cabin. He wasn't expecting anyone, so his heart skipped a beat when he opened it. Standing there was a man in a black suit, holding an envelope with a logo Andrew immediately recognized, the seal of South Valley Development. The man handed him the envelope without a word, and Andrew, already bracing for another legal battle, tore it open. The letter inside was formal, almost cold in its language, and it wasn't an invitation to discuss settlement as Andrew had hoped. Instead, it was a clear and undeniable warning. South Valley, in its infinite power, had filed for a counterclaim in court, and this was the official notice of their intent to pursue a much larger legal strategy against him. They had accused him of deliberate interference with regional development, and worse, they were now pressing charges of defamation and financial obstruction for the way he had gone public with their fraudulent tactics. The letter went on to suggest that Andrew's actions had caused the town's business district to lose thousands of dollars in potential investments, with South Valley claiming that Andrew's lawsuit and public statements had triggered widespread anxiety among potential investors. The letter concluded by saying that if Andrew did not withdraw his claims and cease his public efforts to discredit South Valley, they would seek appropriate compensation through civil court, including the forfeiture of the Merritt property. It was a threat so direct, so brazen, that Andrew could hardly comprehend its implications. It wasn't just a legal strategy anymore. It was an outright attempt to break him. He stood there, staring at the letter in disbelief. He had known the stakes were high, but this was something else. The message was clear. South Valley wasn't just after the land. They were going to ruin him personally, tear down his reputation, and financially cripple him if they had to. Andrew knew that if he backed down now, everything his grandfather had built would be lost. Not just the land, but the history, the legacy, the very spirit of what it meant to live on this land. In that moment, as the anger began to rise within him, something inside Andrew snapped. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. He couldn't. The fight had become about something much larger than land. It was about truth, justice, and the preservation of everything his family had worked for. There was no way he was going to let South Valley steamroll him, even if they had the local government, the legal system, and half the town in their pocket. He called Sarah immediately, his voice firm as he explained what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke it was clear that the weight of the situation was settling in for both of them. "We knew this was coming, Andrew. This is what they do, but we've got to keep going. You're not alone in this. Not anymore." Together, they began to prepare their next steps. Andrew wasn't going to fight this alone. He needed allies, and he needed to expose everything South Valley had done. But as the days wore on, it became apparent that South Valley was pulling every string they could. Their legal team was relentless, their tactics more aggressive. They brought in outside consultants, hired public relations firms, and even went so far as to pressure local media outlets into slanting their coverage in their favor. One evening, as Andrew sat in his cabin going over the documents with Sarah, there was a sudden knock at the door. This time, it wasn't just one person. It was a group. 3 men in dark suits, each with the kind of cold, calculated look that spoke volumes. They weren't here to negotiate, and they weren't here to discuss the case. The tallest one, with a hard jaw and an unsettling smile, introduced himself as Greg Sinclair, the lead attorney for South Valley. He stood there for a moment, watching Andrew closely. "Mr. Merritt," he said with a calm that felt more like a threat than a greeting. "I've been sent here to make you a final offer. We believe we can reach an amicable resolution. If you withdraw your case and stop causing these disruptions, we're willing to let you keep your land, under the condition that we take control of its development, of course." "It's the best deal you're going to get." Andrew's heart raced as he realized what was happening. This wasn't about coming to an agreement. It was about making him feel trapped, making him believe he had no other choice but to sign over the rights to his property. "I won't back down," he said, his voice firm, his hands shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You can't buy me off, Sinclair." Sinclair's smile faded slightly, but there was no anger, no aggression. Just a quiet, unnerving calm. "You don't understand, Mr. Merritt. We've already made arrangements with the county. We've already paid for the zoning changes, and we've already started the groundwork. All we need is your cooperation. The longer you resist, the worse it will get for you. You're making this difficult on yourself, and that's the last thing you want." The words hung in the air like a threat, and Andrew knew the stakes were no longer about land. South Valley was playing a game of intimidation, pushing him into a corner, hoping he'd crack under pressure. They were testing his resolve, trying to force him into a position where he would be too afraid to fight back. But Andrew wasn't going to fold. Not now. Not when everything his grandfather had worked for was on the line. "I'll never give in to you," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'll fight this until the end. You'll have to kill me first." Sinclair didn't say anything in response. He just turned and walked away, the other 2 men following behind him. But Andrew knew, deep down, that the real battle was only just beginning. South Valley had escalated the situation. They had moved from legal tactics to personal intimidation, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. And now, Andrew had no choice but to play the same game they were playing, only this time, he wasn't going to back down. The days that followed the confrontation with Gregory Sinclair were some of the most harrowing of Andrew Merritt's life. The threat hanging over his head, South Valley's calculated attempt to break him through intimidation and legal warfare, was no longer an abstract fear. It was real. The pressure had escalated to levels that Andrew had never imagined when he first began his fight to preserve his grandfather's land. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him at all times, the constant reminder that his every move, every decision, would shape the future of not just his family's legacy, but also the community that had been caught in the crossfire of this corporate land grab. Andrew knew that the next few weeks would be critical. The court hearing was fast approaching, and South Valley was pulling out all the stops to ensure that their development project went ahead as planned. They had already submitted their final zoning applications, paid off key officials in the local government, and secured support from a number of local businesses who, at this point, had their own financial interests tied to the development. All of it was designed to overwhelm him, to push him into a corner where he would have no choice but to give up the fight. But Andrew wasn't about to let that happen. With Sarah's help, he had meticulously built his case, poring over documents, cross-referencing survey records, and gathering evidence of the corruption that had fueled South Valley's rise. The new evidence, particularly the confidential documents Evelyn Gray had provided, detailing internal communications and financial deals that South Valley had concealed, was damning. These weren't just legal violations, they were criminal acts, and Andrew knew that he had the upper hand. What he didn't anticipate, however, was how far South Valley was willing to go to bury him. On the eve of the hearing, as Andrew and Sarah sat in their makeshift war room, reviewing the final details of their strategy, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm, but Andrew recognized it immediately. It was Gregory Sinclair again. "Mr. Merritt?" Sinclair's voice was smooth and almost friendly, the tone that of a man who believed he was in control. "I just wanted to remind you of the stakes here. I know you've been holding on to your grandfather's records and survey maps, and I'm sure you think they'll save you. But you're outmatched, outclassed, and out of time. Tomorrow, the court will rule, and you will be left with nothing. Your land will be gone, your reputation ruined, and you will be forced to watch as South Valley develops the entire region. It's inevitable. You should save yourself the trouble. Withdraw your case and walk away while you still can." Andrew's grip tightened around the phone, his pulse quickening. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Sinclair wasn't speaking from a place of negotiation anymore. He was speaking as though he knew the outcome was already decided. But what struck Andrew most was how Sinclair believed he could break him so easily, how he thought that a simple warning would make him back down. "Go ahead and make your move, Sinclair," Andrew said, his voice colder than he felt. "But I'm not walking away. Not now. Not ever." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Andrew thought the call had ended. Then Sinclair spoke again, his voice still smooth, but with an unmistakable edge. "I thought you'd say that," he said, almost as if it had been expected. "You'll regret it." The line went dead. Andrew set the phone down slowly, his mind racing. He knew Sinclair was right about one thing. This was no longer just about land. This was a battle of wills, and South Valley was determined to break his spirit. They had crossed the line from legal intimidation to personal threat, and now, Andrew realized, there was no turning back. It wasn't just about keeping his grandfather's legacy intact. It was about survival. The next morning, Andrew and Sarah arrived at the courthouse early. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and the courtroom was already filling with people. South Valley's legal team was there, of course, sitting together in their sleek suits, their confident faces showing no sign of worry. Behind them, a few key officials from the local government were also present, their presence enough to send a clear signal. This was their game, and they were playing for keeps. Andrew couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as he walked into the room. The walls, the people, even the air itself seemed to press in on him. Everything about this moment felt monumental, like the weight of history itself was in the balance. He had prepared for this day for months, and yet, standing in the courtroom, he felt a pit in his stomach that was hard to ignore. Sarah leaned in, her voice low but firm. "We've got this, Andrew. We've got the truth on our side, and we've got the evidence. Just stick to the facts. We're not here to play their game. We're here to expose them." Andrew nodded, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't going to let the pressure break him. Not now. Not after everything he had fought for. He had spent his entire life studying the land, understanding its boundaries and its history. That knowledge, that connection, was his weapon, and today he was going to use it. The hearing began, and the judge, a stern man with little patience for theatrics, called the proceedings to order. South Valley's legal team went first, presenting their arguments with precision and polish. They painted a picture of Andrew as a stubborn landowner who was refusing to let progress happen, a man clinging to outdated records that no longer applied to the modern landscape. They tried to discredit his grandfather's work, claiming that the survey records were irrelevant in the face of new development needs and updated zoning laws. Their argument was simple. Andrew's objections were not only misplaced, they were delaying the inevitable growth of the community. But Andrew wasn't intimidated. When it was his turn to speak, he stood tall, his hands steady as he presented his case. He outlined the history of the land, his grandfather's contributions to the region, and the meticulous surveying work that had established the boundaries of the property. He detailed how South Valley had manipulated the zoning laws and falsified records to claim ownership of a land that didn't belong to them. He presented the documents Evelyn had given him, the internal memos and emails that exposed the backroom deals and corrupt practices that had allowed South Valley to bypass the rules. The courtroom fell silent as Andrew spoke. It wasn't just his words, it was the evidence he had gathered, the facts that couldn't be disputed. The judge leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the documents Andrew had presented. Sarah watched the proceedings closely, her face unreadable, but Andrew could tell that she knew they were gaining ground. And then, just as it seemed that the tide was turning in Andrew's favor, South Valley's attorneys pulled their trump card. They produced a witness, one of the local government officials who had been involved in the zoning approval process. The man, a former county commissioner named Robert Haynes, took the stand and testified that he had reviewed the zoning changes thoroughly and had found them to be in compliance with all legal guidelines. His testimony was a powerful blow. It wasn't just a matter of legal manipulation anymore. It was now a matter of local authority, and Haynes had the ear of the judge. But Andrew didn't flinch. He had expected this. He had prepared for it. He called his next witness, Evelyn Gray. Evelyn's testimony was nothing short of explosive. She detailed her experience working for South Valley, describing how she had been part of the early planning stages of the development, and how she had witnessed firsthand the company's disregard for the law. She recounted conversations where officials from South Valley had discussed their plans to bypass environmental regulations and manipulate local government officials to expedite the approval process. Her statement painted a damning picture of corporate malfeasance, and as she spoke, the room seemed to shift. The judge's expression hardened, and the tension in the air was palpable. South Valley's legal team scrambled, but it was clear they were losing control of the narrative. The evidence had been laid bare, and the truth was undeniable. Andrew's grandfather's legacy had stood the test of time, and now it was standing as a beacon against the corporate greed that threatened to erase it. As the hearing came to a close, the judge adjourned the court for deliberation. Andrew sat in silence, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. He had done everything he could. Now it was in the judge's hands. He could only wait, knowing that whatever happened next would change the course of his life and the life of the land, forever. The courtroom was silent as the judge returned from his chambers, the heavy oak doors creaking open. His footsteps echoed across the room, the sound somehow more resonant than usual. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath, as if collectively waiting for the moment that would decide the fate of Andrew Merritt's land. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Andrew sat in the front row, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the judge, waiting for a ruling that could change everything. As the judge took his seat, he cleared his throat, his voice steady and authoritative. "This has been a complex case, and I've reviewed the evidence carefully. Both sides have made their arguments, and it's clear that the stakes are high. But after considering all the facts and testimony presented, I have come to a decision." Andrew's heart raced as the words hung in the air. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Everything he had fought for, the late nights, the sleepless hours spent gathering evidence, the strain of facing a corporation that seemed invincible, had led up to this moment. Would it be enough? Would the truth be enough? The judge paused for a brief moment, scanning the room before continuing. "I have ruled in favor of Mr. Merritt. South Valley Development's claims to the land in question are invalid. The evidence presented clearly shows that their actions have violated zoning regulations and, more significantly, have disregarded the established boundaries of the property as set by Mr. Merritt's grandfather's survey. The land is and will remain under the ownership of Andrew Merritt." The room erupted into a mixture of disbelief, relief, and quiet murmurings. Andrew felt a rush of emotions flood through him, the weight that had been pressing on him for so long now lifting. It was hard to believe it was real, to understand that after everything, the pressure, the threats, the legal battles, it was over. He had won. South Valley's legal team looked stunned, caught off guard by the ruling. Gregory Sinclair, who had been so confident in his victory just days before, now looked as if the wind had been knocked out of him. The other attorneys stood in stunned silence, unable to respond to the overwhelming evidence that had been presented. They had come to this battle expecting a quick victory, assuming that their corporate influence and financial resources would crush anyone who dared to stand against them. But they had underestimated Andrew Merritt, a man with nothing but his grandfather's legacy and the truth on his side. For a moment, Andrew didn't move. He just sat there, the words of the judge echoing in his mind. He had fought for so long, with every ounce of strength he had, and now it had paid off. His grandfather's land, his family's land, was safe. The history of the Merritt family, the work his grandfather had done, the memories they had shared would not be erased. The land would remain, as it had been for generations, a testament to the hard work and dedication of those who had come before him. When the judge finally called the court to adjourn, Andrew stood slowly, his legs stiff from hours of sitting. Sarah was already at his side, her expression a mixture of pride and relief. "You did it, Andrew. You really did it," she said, her voice low but filled with emotion. Andrew nodded, not trusting himself to speak at first. He felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of the victory settling over him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent so much time focused on the fight, on the strategy, on the legal battles, that he hadn't fully grasped what it would feel like to win. But now, as he looked around the room at the people who had supported him, the community that had rallied behind him, he knew that this wasn't just about his family's land. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up to those who thought they could take what wasn't theirs, who believed they could rewrite history to suit their own agenda. In the weeks that followed, the town began to heal. The development that South Valley had once planned for the area was halted. The zoning changes that had been quietly pushed through were reversed, and the land that had been targeted for commercial development was once again protected under its original designation. Andrew worked closely with local officials to ensure that the community would have a say in any future developments, and that no one would be able to manipulate the system the way South Valley had. For Andrew, the victory was bittersweet. He had won, but it had come at a cost. The battle had taken its toll on him, both physically and emotionally. There were moments when he had doubted whether he could continue, moments when the weight of the fight had seemed too much to bear. But in the end, he had held on, driven by the desire to protect his family's legacy and preserve the land that had meant so much to him. The legal victory was important, but the real victory lay in the fact that he had stood up to a force that had seemed unbeatable and emerged victorious. South Valley, though defeated in court, didn't go quietly. The corporation filed appeals, trying to overturn the ruling, but Andrew remained steadfast. With each passing day, their efforts became more desperate, more underhanded. They attempted to buy up more land in the surrounding area, hoping to build their development in another part of the region, but the damage had already been done. Their reputation had been irrevocably tarnished, and they were no longer the untouchable powerhouse they had once been. For the Merritt family, the victory was a reaffirmation of everything they had stood for. Andrew took a step back from the legal battles and began to focus on what mattered most, reconnecting with the land. He started working on the cabin he had always dreamed of building, a place where he could find peace, where he could honor his grandfather's memory, and where he could finally put the past behind him. The cabin was small, simple, and built with his own hands, but it became a symbol of resilience, a physical manifestation of his determination to hold on to what was rightfully his. As the years passed, Andrew continued to care for the land, keeping it intact and protecting it from any future threats. He stayed involved in local affairs ensuring that the lessons learned from his battle with South Valley would not be forgotten. He worked alongside other landowners to establish a local coalition that could protect the region from future corporate overreach, ensuring that the area remained a place where history, nature, and community could coexist. But the victory wasn't just his. It was the community's. The town had rallied around him during the legal battle, and in the end, they had all emerged stronger for it. The people who had once been divided, who had once feared standing up against a corporation with deep pockets and political power, now knew that they could make a difference. They had seen firsthand what could happen when one person stood up against injustice, when one person refused to back down in the face of overwhelming odds. Andrew's victory had inspired them all, reminding them that even in the face of the most powerful forces, the truth and the will of the people could still prevail. And so, with the land protected and the fight finally behind him, Andrew Merritt could finally begin to look to the future with hope. The weight that had once hung over him had lifted, and in its place was a sense of peace, a peace that came from knowing that he had fought the right fight, that he had stood firm when it mattered most, and that his family's legacy would endure, untouched by the greed and corruption that had once threatened to erase it.